generous amount of time. So, as representative of Snowshoe and according to the legislation that we were able to get passed through the legislature this past spring, I think we're about 2 weeks from being able to present this commission with a petition to authorize the creation of a snowshoe resort area district. So with that said, I did look forward to the opportunity to come here and talk to you guys in a public forum and sort of give you an idea of what that petition is about, the types of discussions that we've had amongst homeowners and other folks up at the mountain, and to be able to answer any questions that you may have. I guess before I go any further though, this is the first time I'm presenting this to the commission. I can go back to the genesis as far back as the commission would like me to go and give it, an entire synopsis of kind of what has generated and brought us to this date. You may find that useful. Obviously I live this stuff every day. You guys, this is, part of what you guys are. So I'm very familiar with the details, if not too familiar. So I can do that, or I can sort of fast forward to sort of the past few weeks as we prepared the petition and where we are with that. So.
Well, I think we've got time, Mr. DeBerry, so probably, since it's the first time we've discussed this together in public,
okay.
Let's sort of start from day one.
All right, excellent. So I arrived a little more than 2.5 years ago at Snowshoe. And in my first season here, part of what I learned my role was to create a budget for what's called the Mountaintop Assessment Fund. The Mountaintop Assessment Fund is set up so that all property owners on the mountain, nearly all, there are some exceptions because it's a deed mandated contract, and some deeds don't actually have the mandate in them depending on when they were developed. But there's some version of language in nearly every deed on the mountain that requires every homeowner on the mountain, every business owner on the mountain to contribute into this Mountaintop Assessment Fund, and for the resort to use those funds to provide community type services such as public safety, fire protection, common area roads and grounds maintenance, snow clearing. As in the 90s, it was agreed within an agreement between SPOC and the mountain that transportation would fit under that belt. And the way that the language is written is, it's those things and other items that would be deemed community benefit to the mountain. So that fund is set up, and unfortunately there are about 14 different versions of that language depending on what deed was done when, under what Snowshoe leadership, between what condo developer and whomever it was. It's pretty common when if you start a resort, you know that there's going to be, in a destination resort, a real estate component to that. You know people are going to build vacation homes up there. In fact, it's probably part of your business model to develop and sell some of those homes, and that's what helps build the resort. You know that other people will want to do the same. So it's common to set up some sort of a mechanism so that as this community develops, that community is able to sustain itself moving forward. In many resorts, you may literally take up every bit of developable land, then the developer as a function doesn't exist anymore, and somebody's got to, own and control those functions. At Snowshoe, this mountaintop assessment mechanism was used. Today, you would almost surely use what would be considered a master association. A master association essentially is set up with its own board of directors representing the different types of commercial or developer or residential or resort operations groups within the resort, and that board would then control all. I offhandedly refer to it as all the bits and pieces that fall in between all the different associations. We have several associations on the mountain. So it would do what the mountaintop assessment does. But that board would also control the funding, control the operations, and from a funding standpoint, more so than Snowshoe has the ability. This is really set up as an agreement of homeowner, you pay Snowshoe, Snowshoe, you do some services, right? The issue that was coming up when I came on board was that through the decline of property values over the years, the fund has actually been decreasing in the amount of funding available to do these things. Then on top of that, you combine the fact that over the years, a lot of infrastructure has been built. And so that infrastructure was never built with any capital reserve funding in mind. It was never built with an idea of, if we build Westridge Road, eventually that road's, we build and we pave this road, eventually it's going to need a complete repaving. How is that going to be funded? And the current methodology that we use, because it matches the most restrictive form of language across the entire mountain, and we're trying to be consistent, restricts us to only ever increasing our funding by the consumer price index for the prior year. So every year, whatever the CPI is, and I believe it was 1.4% this past year. So we were able to take our funding and increase it by 1.4% over last year. The other side of that is we have a cap of never exceeding 1.5% of somebody's property value. Reasonable.
1.5%?
1.5%. Problem is, as property values come down and you start to hit that 1.5% ceiling, then you try to bump them back up, even as values may come up a bit. You get to a point where you're actually increasing. If CPI really kind of defines your expenses, it's the price index. It's what it costs to do stuff. So if what it costs to do stuff is going up by 1.5%, and prior to that it was 3%, and prior to that I think it was 2.5%, but you're only ever able to increase your expenses by slightly less than that because you're hitting these other caps. You don't actually keep up with the cost of doing things, and that's just regular.
What is that 1.5% cap? That's
of the person's property value. That's the deed says that this assessment can never exceed 1.5% of your property value, and that's fairly common in municipal government and things like that. That some sort of a cap.
So if it was 1.4, you said last year.
CPI the consumer price index was 1.4%.
And you can raise that an additional 1.4 this year?
We're allowed to, because CPI was 1.4, we can take last year's expenses and increase our budget by 1.4% this year.
Okay.
Minus the amount that, so if we take that and we distribute that across, but we go to put that assessment on your property and it's dropped in value and we're hitting the 1.5% of property value, we have to back off your assessment so that we don't exceed that 1.5%.
So, like you said, last year or a couple years ago, the CPI went up about 2%.
Yeah, it's been in the 2 and 3% for the past few years since I've been here.
That's the problem. When the CPI goes up, say 2%,
right, and
you want to try to balance that out, all you're allowed to do by the deeds, by the MTA rules, is you just raise 1.5%. That's your maximum. No, and that's
I know it's I will tell you, it literally took months for me to figure out how all of this works. But no, we can go up by the 2% as long as we don't exceed 1.5% of your property value.
Okay.
Right. So
it's sort of different measures.
Right. So and actually that's been a source of there's a current litigation in process over the confusing language that's out there. So, but that's a bit of a side note.
So depending, if the property values were extremely large, for example, then you wouldn't have to go up much percentage to get 2% of the consumer price index.
Right. If property values return to 2008, for example, we wouldn't be worrying about the 1.5%. What we would be worried about then is the fact that we've gone through so many years of austerity that we've got a lot of deferred maintenance, and we can still, the property values can go up this fast, but over time, but the consumer price index is only going to go up like this. So we can't return the fund to what it had when property values were high. In addition, there was in I believe it was 2008, as sort of a goodwill gesture, there was a surplus in funding, and the gesture was, well, things are looking a little scary right now. We don't necessarily want to just come up with reasons to spend that money. We're going to actually return that to the budget next year, and we'll lower everybody's assessment. So for 1 year, the idea was lower people's assessments. And then the next year, they wanted to go back to the baseline of 2 years ago. But they were told, well, no, my assessment last year was this. You can only go up by CPI. And that reduced the amount of funding available to the fund by $300,000 per year for life, which was literally about 12% of the funding just gone. You know, and there was no way to ever claim that back because of the CPI cap. So we find ourselves today in a situation where the mountain is able to conduct operations. You know, we've reduced services in many areas over the past couple of years. We spend less on public safety. We spend less on fire protection. We spend what it takes to clear the snow off the roads, right? I mean, that's and what happens there is if there's a lot of snow, then we spend less on grounds. You know, so when people are calling up saying you haven't mowed near my property, or or haven't taken care of the potholes or things like that, that's because we spent all of our budget clearing snow, right? So we're at a point where we're getting the job done, but we're also at a point where the infrastructure that was built is aging, and some of it, is coming to the point where it will fail in the next few years. And I've had people come up to me, for example, and they'll say, "Well, when will you be able to repave my road?" And I say, "Well, projecting out funding today, I would say approximately never." I mean, literally, there is no scenario under which I can envision being able to rebuild a shuttle stop or repave a road that's out there. So we've got to come up with a solution to those types of things. Beyond that, we've also developed into a full-on community.